The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. He began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you, and utter every kind of evil against you falsely because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven." The Gospel of the Lord. If you wonder why we read the Gospel of Matthew today and we read the Beatitudes, it's important to understand that Scripture scholars tell us there are two high points in the Bible, one in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament, that sort of put everything together. In the Old Testament, it's the Ten Commandments. It expresses the law of God and his relationship with people and people with each other and with God. And in the New Testament, the highest expression are the Beatitudes. Now, a lot of times we've heard these Beatitudes throughout the years and really have never heard them at the same time. Because to read them in the exact language of the Gospel of Matthew in Aramaic, it doesn't even come close to what we have here. Now, I have given a homily on the Beatitudes many, many times, so I decided to stay away from it this time. Because most of, I know, our own parishioners who come to Mass, we have the Beatitude. I usually will go through the Beatitudes, but just to give you an idea, and the idea behind the Beatitudes, of course, it's supposed to be a mirror reflection of the soul of Christ, and it's supposed to be the same thing in every Christian soul that reflects Christ. It speaks to each and every one of us and everyone who is baptized. But just to give you, let me give you the first one. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It's a bad translation. Because in Aramaic, it's very, very simple. Blessed are they who beg. Wow. What a difference. Blessed are they who beg. That's what Christ said, that's what Matthew wrote. Now, sometimes I know it's very difficult to translate the Aramaic and the Greek into the English language. Matter of fact, it's supposed to be very difficult to get it right. So, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I'm not sure that that's even close. Well, blessed are the poor in spirit has nothing to do with being poor at all. Blessed are they who beg is a soul that depends absolutely on God for everything in life. Who beg before God and thank God for everything that they have. They depend on God for everything. As a child of God, we're supposed to be able to do that. That's how the Beatitudes start out. And the rest of them follow that first one. We must learn how to become absolutely dependent on God. We don't have to stand on the corner with a street sign begging for money. That's not it. We don't have to be poor. We have many saints who were rich. Kings, queens, emperors, you name it. Poor in spirit here is detached from oneself, from one's self-love, from pride, and from the world and all of its attachments and attractions. Because the soul is completely attached to God. It is empty of the material world. instead of being attached to so many things. If you want to know what you're attached to, just try to pray. And I said this only a couple of weeks ago in my homily. You'll find out very quickly what is causing you problems when you try to pray, let's say, a decade of the rosary. Whatever distracts you in your mind, that's what you're attached to. And we're all distracted in prayer, so we all have things that we're attached to. So we don't have the first beatitude quite down correctly yet. So as I was preparing this homily, I said, well, I've talked about that enough. Let me stay away from it this year. And we'll come across again it throughout the next year as we read the Gospels. So I want to talk a little bit about the saints, because we're all called through our baptism to become saints. And I want people to understand that we aren't born saints. Nobody is. Saints don't just come out of the womb and that's it. And all of a sudden they're going to grow up and just be saints, kind of a thing. St. Thomas Aquinas was asked by one of his sisters, what do I have to do to become a saint? His answer was very simple. He said, will it. In other words, desire it. Make every effort in your life to live a God-like life and everything that God asks of you. The saints are a fascinating company of men and women and even children who devoted their lives to Christ and His teaching in many ways. They came from every walk of life, from poor peasants tilling the soil to eke out a living, poverty-stricken slum dwellers and of large cities, to emperors and kings and queens, murderers, cutthroats, robbers who repented of their evil lives, and listed next to holy men and women who lived lives of holiness and austerity from early childhood. One of the things I used to do also on the Feast of All Saints, I used to like to tell the story of at least 3 or 4 saints, because a lot of us in a modern world, we have different idols today. We follow football players, basketball players, we follow technology, that's our idol. We don't follow the saints anymore. We don't take their example of virtue and holiness as an example for ourselves. We don't read their lives. We have no idea who our patron saint is. We have no idea who we're named after. We got no clue. Our confirmation saint, don't know who that is. Our baptismal saint, we don't even know who that is, but that's the problem. We don't follow the saints anymore. It used to be, at one time, around the year 800, exactly in the year 800, the church tried to stamp out this pagan celebration of the harvest festival, which came from the Druid worship, Druids, which is paganism at its best. The Romans hated the Druids so much they tried to kill them in the 1st century AD. And they thought they had stamped them out. They stood in opposition against all of their idols and their false gods. So they just went underground. Many centuries later, they came back to the surface in Ireland and in England. When the potato famine hit in Ireland and they came over here, they brought this pagan Druid worship with them. And it began in New England. They call it the Harvest Festival, now known as Halloween. This is the high feast day of the Luciferians, those who honor Lucifer. Today they will have celebrations and rituals in honor of Lucifer all over the world. Thousands, dressed in costumes. The reason for that being is that people, they believed that if they had an enemy that had died, that if they didn't have a costume on, because the supernatural barrier between the natural world broke down for one day, for one night, that they had to get dressed up in a costume and put food out, so they wouldn't come after them and wouldn't kill them, and so on and so on. But it's a pagan practice. Now we call it Halloween. And don't realize we're participating in a superstitious practice. It's got nothing to do with Catholicism at all. I've asked priests, I've asked bishops, show me Halloween in the missal. Show me the Mass. Show me where it's got anything to do with God. It doesn't. But anyways, I don't want to get too far off track with all of that. But I know people always will say to me, Father, it's only a little kids thing. It's so harmless. No, the Catechism makes it very clear. As Catholics, we do not participate in superstition of any kind. In the 800s, the Church tried to get rid of that feast for the Catholics, to give them All Hallows Eve. People would get dressed up in the costume of their favorite saints, and they would put on plays. Churches would be open all night. There would be adoration and prayer until All Souls Day, the next day. They were intimately connected. What is it today? It's the number one plastic spending holiday in the United States. It's the number one holiday in France because 95% of the people in France don't go to church. They got to replace it with something. And the devil's going to be right there. And I guarantee everybody says, oh, it's so innocent, it's harmless, and so on. There's nothing harmless about it. We're called to imitate the saints, to imitate their holiness. Men, women, and children, black, white, red, yellow, brown, clergy, laity, powerful, helpless, eloquent, tongue-tied, all are represented in this glorious company of the saints. And people often like to think it's only priests or nuns. No, it's not. We have many, many married saints. If you know the story of St. Teresa, the little flower, her mother and father were just canonized a couple of years back. St. Teresa, the little flower, is a doctor of the church. She was in a Carmelite monastery with 5 of her sisters. They're in the process of, she's already canonized, she's a doctor of the church. They're in the process now of canonizing the other 4 sisters. It'll be the first time in church history, Catholic church history, that an entire family will be canonized and raised to the altar of the saints. So it is possible. Some years ago when I was in Rome, I was visiting a church in Rome that had the relics of the Passion of Christ in it. And there was a side chapel. And I went into that side chapel, and there was a grave of a 7-year-old girl that was built into the wall. And I don't remember her name today, but I picked up the card and I read her story. She's in the process of being canonized. She will be the youngest saint in the church to be canonized as an actual saint. She suffered much in her young life, and she kept a diary. And that's how we know she lived a holy life. Her parents found it after she died. We have a 12-year-old girl that's already blessed, whose mother was a prostitute. And she said to God, I will offer my life. I will offer myself. She's 12 years old. What are 12-year-olds doing today? Buy me this, give me that, and so on and so on. She offered her life to Christ, said, convert my mother and save her soul, and I will offer myself, and I will suffer anything you ask of me. She suffered for 2 years, tuberculosis, and she died 2 years later at the age of 14. Saints of all ages, things we never read about, things we don't hear about, because we don't make the effort, but it's there. The forms of holiness are varied, as is mankind. Men and women living lives of great austerity alone on a barren island or in deserts performing the most astonished mortifications or penances. Others living in crowded cities ministering to the needy and the stricken. And still others living in castles and at royal courts. Some of the saints perform the most menial task in the almost total obscurity. And don't let me get into that one, because it might make your face shrivel if I told you some of the stories of some of our saints and how they would help the sick. Others worked in the full glare of the prominence accorded men and women in prominent position, if they were kings or queens. For the church, like her master, ignores the arbitrary distinction humans make of class, race, color, and position in choosing her saints, but rather selects those who in some outstanding way have devoted themselves to following the path laid out for all men and women by God becoming man, Jesus Christ. In other words, we call this being virtuous. The human being imitates Christ. He doesn't have to grow a beard. He doesn't have to be a male. He has to be a certain size. Everybody's called to be virtuous, to have the habit of virtues in one's soul. And that's how we grow in holiness. And these men and women all had these virtues. They all didn't have the same virtues. Some had charity, some had love, some had kindness, and so on and so on. Given the dazzling diversity and the varied appeals of all the saints, it is a pity that in recent years the appeal of the saints has sunk to an all-time low, and it has. It is, in part, this is due to skepticism that is so prevalent. It became prevalent in the 1960s, and a consequent demythologizing of heroes with no distinction. In part, it is due to the now generation attitude that all past history is irrelevant and all knowledge is strictly the providence of a present generation, and that certainly is a mindset today. As if that generation had sprung up full-blown, all-knowing, all-wise, with no ties to acknowledgement or accomplishment of the past, and led to the incredible stores of knowledge which we have now accumulated in the 20th century, as if somehow it just came along. Fortunately, there has been a change, or there's becoming a change in this attitude. Many of the priests are going back to saying the masses of the saints, because a lot of times they're optionals. But I do it anyways, as even in the most ardent practitioners come to realize that this generation is no more adept at solving the problem that has plagued mankind for thousands of years than those that have preceded us. But also to be faced and accepted is the fact that often many of our saints do not have meaning for us today. That many of the so-called miracles attributed to them are pretty fantastic, and they may even be meaningless to us. That many of the practices, some of the saints not only have no place in our modern world, but may actually be repugnant to our modern sensibilities, which in the end I basically can't understand. But we certainly can talk of someone like Simon the Stylite sitting on a pillar for 36 years. So it offers us an idea of what the second century monks were doing in the desert. He lived on top of a pillar which 3 foot by 3 foot, never came down, never slept, never lay down. He knelt, he stood, and that was it. And he did everything with a basket. And the reason, you might say to yourself, why would somebody do that? A simple reason for it being is the saints knew how dangerous the world was. How easy it is to get attached to material things. How easy to get attached to worldly ideologies and to get caught up in what everybody else is into. The saints understood that quite well, and the greater distance they could have from that, the better they felt. So living on a pillar for 36 years for me has no problems. And there were many. He wasn't the only one. He was just one of the more famous ones because he worked so many miracles. What would happen to a preacher today who beat himself with whips and chains before his sermons and then stumbled to the pulpit with blood streaming down his face and body to begin his sermon? And I think of St. Peter of Alcantara. I think of Gaspar de Buffalo, saints you probably have never heard of, but these are saints who scourged themselves. It's like St. Benedict. Whenever he had a particular temptation towards impurity, he would throw himself into a rose bush. He said, if I can't take this suffering, how can I take the pains of hell? As pleasing as impurities and things throws itself at us, he knew the dangers of that sin and that temptation. And many of us saints had many different ways of overcoming temptations. Nowadays, we don't even care. We just fall into them and don't pay attention to them. But if somebody came today and they had scourged themselves and they were bleeding and they were begging us to save our souls, we probably think, man, this guy's crazy. I'm out of here. But that's just it. Who today can understand and appreciate the drastic bodily mortification and penitence that many saints impose on themselves for many decades of their lives? Who today can believe that a word of a mere mortal could divert a river or dry up a lake? Of course, like Christ himself, diverting the Jordan River, or the fantastic miracles performed seemingly at a whim. None of these make much sense to people today because we have the wrong idols. No basketball player, no football player is going to work a miracle. That only comes by God. And it comes usually through the lives of his saints. St. Benedict, One day, he was walking through the woods on his way back to the monastery. I'll tell you a couple of stories anyways, things you've probably have never heard, but I think it's good to be interested in the lives of the saints. I've been reading them for years. St. Benedict, he's walking through the woods. He's on his way back to the monastery, and he hears this loud yelp. And he wonders what it is, because the woods are pretty thick. So he goes towards the yelp, and he comes upon a man who apparently was riding a horse pretty fast through the woods. And he didn't see the limb there. And the limb caught him right here, cut his head off. When he fell off of his horse, there was one little attachment on the back of his neck to his body. He literally was dead. St. Benedict took his head, put it on his body, made the sign of the cross. The guy coughed, got up, got on his horse, and went away. This is what saints can do. You know, on February 3rd, we have our throat blessed. Why do we do that? Because that particular saint, on his way to martyrdom, a woman came to her screaming. One of her children had a fish bone caught in her throat. And she asked the saint, please, my child is going to die. He made the sign of the cross, and the fish bone just went doink, and it came out. We celebrate St. Valentine's Day, or Valentine's Day in the modern world with chocolates and roses. We call it a day of love, but we have no clue that St. Valentine is an actual saint. He was a priest. In the 2nd and 3rd century in Rome, he went against the emperor's orders. They were not allowed to get married, because if they were married, they wouldn't go out and fight the emperor's battles. They wanted to stay home with their wives and raise families. So he forbade marriage, the emperors. And Valentine was marrying them underground secretly, going against the emperor's wishes. Well, he was found out. He was tortured and fed to the animals. So we have a lot of wonderful examples of holiness today. St. Valentine's Day is a chocolate and rose day. Nobody's got any idea that it actually belongs to the Catholic Church, and it's actually a Catholic saint. He actually existed, and he actually lived. So many other saints that we have made toys out of, and like Christopher and George and so on. These are actual saints. We have their lives' history. We have their life stories. Peter of Alcantara, just to give you one, he was a spiritual director of St. Teresa of Avila, the great doctor of the Church of Prayer. Ate every 40 days, one meal. Drank no water. Lived off the Eucharist. Slept on his knees, with his head leaning against the wall with a pillow sticking out. Pillar, not pillow, pillar. A little thin pillar sticking out of the wall. He leaned against it. That's how he slept for 40 years. St. Teresa of Avila describes him literally as a walking tree. His skin was like bark. He'd been outdoor for so many years of his life. And whenever he had a temptation towards anything, he would run to the nearest cold river that he could find, and he would jump in it, even in the wintertime, to help him to overcome the temptation, because he knew if he couldn't stand this, he certainly wasn't going to take hell. I'll tell you one more. One of my favorite saints that you've never heard of, probably St. Severin of Sedov. He's a Russian saint. He's also canonized by the Latin Rite Church. By us, he belongs to us as well. A unique monk, a favorite man of prayer. Whenever he spoke, the Holy Spirit, he would light up, his eyes would light up. And when he would speak to someone, the Holy Spirit would come out of his eyes and penetrate the soul of the person he was speaking to, and he would say to them, "Can you feel the presence of the Spirit?" And they'd say, "Yeah." And it brought them joy. He was often so warm that a bear would come and stay in his cave for his winter sabbatical or whatever the bears do. To stay warm, he slept at his feet. Because St. Seraphim was so fired up with God. As St. Catherine of Siena said, God is fire. Not a fire that destroys, not a fire that consumes, but the fire of love that is God. He wants to consume us, yes, but not destroy us. But these are just some of the saints. Like I said, normally part of my homily is to tell you some of those stories, but that's all I have for now. So just think about these Beatitudes. Blessed are they who mourn. Has got nothing to do with anybody who died. It's got something to do with those who mourn for their sins because they committed them. Shedding tears for one's faults. Blessed are the meek, to be humble before God. They will inherit the land. It isn't the land that we're after. It's this land here. Blessed are they in hunger and thirst for righteousness, those who want to seek the truth. Many people, they don't care about the truth. They don't care about absolute truth. Righteousness here is virtue. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for virtue. They will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful. For anybody who's wept for their own sins knows how to be merciful because they know how to show mercy. Blessed are the pure of heart. By the time you get to this beatitude, you've already got a pure heart. You will see God. Like the saints who experienced God, St. Teresa and many, many, many saints who had a living experience with God and see God in the depths of their soul, present to them. And we often know, and I've said this in my prayer homily, we think God is up there, or he's got a big ear, and when we pray, he listens to us. Not it. The journey of prayer takes the human being into the depths of their soul, into the depths of their being, to find God inside. Why is it that the Eucharist, body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ comes inside of me? So I may find him there. So he can transform me from the inside out. So I can become Christ-like. Blessed are the peacemakers. Has nothing to do with making two people at peace. For two countries being at peace, it has everything to do with having the order of peace in the human soul. Sin is a disorder in the human soul, always. No matter how small the sin is, it's a disorder. Blessed are they who are peacemakers because they've made peace in their soul with God, with themselves, and with their neighbor. It's not a military order. It's the absolute order and peace of God dwelling in the soul, and that kind of soul is the one that can work miracles. And that's just to give you some idea of the Beatitudes.